Photoshop provides us with a whole suite of tools that we can use in order to change and modify color. And working on color in Photoshop is a lot of fun. In this first movie, we'll look at an image adjustment that we can use, which is called Replace Color. In order to work with Replace Color, let's copy the background layer. To do that, click into the background layer and drag it to the New Layer icon, or press Command-J on a Mac or Control-J on Windows. We'll go ahead and name this new layer Color. Next, navigate to the Image pull-down menu. Here we're going to Adjustments, and then we're going to go almost to the bottom of this menu, all the way down there to Replace Color. This will open up our Replace Color dialog. We'll see a dialog similar to this in other situations, yet we'll start off with it here. You'll notice that we have a few options. We have an eyedropper. What we can do with this eyedropper is we can sample a color, like the sky color in the background. It will then build a mask. Here it's showing us what it's selected. It selected this area, the white area most, and then these areas a little bit less. Now if we go down to our sliders which allow us to replace the color, we can use hue, saturation, or lightness. Lightness has to do with brightness, saturation, how intense the color is, and then hue allows us to change the color. So if I change the color, say if I want a green sky for some reason, we can see how that change is starting to come into play. Well, obviously, it isn't very good. We need to fix it up. We can do that with the eyedropper, which has a plus next to it. Go ahead and click on that, and then just click and drag around your photograph. As you do that, you can click and drag on all of these little details in order to select this part of the image. If you find that you still have a few rough patches, as I do here, you can increase the fuzziness. As I increase the fuzziness, it's going to soften out the selection area, and also it's going to broaden the reach of that selection. So here with this photograph, we have pretty consistent and pretty good color change based on our selection. Now we can change this one way or another. We can change the sky color in a lot of different ways. Sometimes what we might want to do is just perhaps boost the overall saturation. Well, we could do that, or of course, we could change the overall color characteristics. The great thing about working with Replace Color is it allows us to target specific colors. Now, let's say with this photograph, we want to have some fun, and we also want to change the color of the sign. Well, you can't change two colors at once. So here you have to apply that change, then go back to the Image pull-down menu, choose Adjustments, and then relaunch Replace Color. Click on the menu item, Replace Color. That will relaunch this dialog, and this time we want to click on the red of the sign. Now again, if we don't have enough of the red, we can add to this by holding on the Shift key. That temporarily allows you to access that icon which you can add to. So in order to see how that works, let's change the color here. And you know what? This looks pretty good for the most part, except I noticed it didn't select this part of the sign. So I'll hold down the Shift key, and I'll click and drag over those areas, and I'll just do that in a couple areas here in order to make sure I have all of the signs selected. Rather than a purple sign, how about maybe a blue sign? That might be kind of fun. And again, we can control the saturation as well. To apply this change, click OK. Now here we have a new layer where we have some pretty fantastic and some pretty different colors. Sometimes you'll use this command in order to create wacky or interesting colors like we have here. Other times you can use it for more subtle color effects as well. Either way, what I recommend you do is first copy your background layer, then apply those adjustments to a new layer so that if you make a mistake, you can always go back to the original color and then try again by creating a new layer. And by having this extra layer, well, it just gives us more flexibility when we're working with that image adjustment, which is called Replace Color. All right, let's continue to talk about how we can replace and change color. And in this movie, we'll take a look at an example which is a bit more complicated. This image will require that we take a few steps. We'll start off using Replace Color, and then next we'll make a selection and finish the project off using hue saturation in order to work on another area of the photograph. We'll be working with this portrait of a professional musician. This guy is the drummer for Ben Harper's band, and you can tell that he really loves what he does. He's a phenomenal drummer, and let's say that the record label has asked us if we can change the color of the stripes of his shirt and also his hat in order to match the color palette and the graphic design of his album, which is about to come out. And they want these stripes in the hat to be a subtle navy blue. So we say, okay, no problem, we can do this. And here's how. We'll copy the background layer, click and drag that to the new layer icon, and name this new layer Color. Next, navigate to the Image pull-down menu and choose Adjustments. And then you know where we're going, right? We're going all the way down to replace color. First, we'll work on the stripes here. We can do this by clicking on the stripes in order to start to build up a selection. Now we need to add to the selection, obviously, so hold down the Shift key and click and drag across the stripes. Now as you're dragging across this area, if you notice that you're selecting more colors than you want to select, what you can do is work with what's called localized color clusters. Now when you turn this on, what it will do is it will limit your selection to the area where you're clicking so that you won't select, say, the color of the hat, because I need to work on the hat in a different way than the stripes because they're a different shade of green. Well, next we can increase our fuzziness by cranking this slider up a little bit, then hold down the Shift key and just click and drag across the stripes. As you start to work to make these selections, what you'll want to do eventually, of course, is check your progress. One way you can do that is by dragging the hue slider around. Here I'll drag this to the right to see how this is starting to look, and it's looking pretty good. We'll desaturate this by dragging our saturation slider to the left a little bit. Here I want to try to create a nice navy blue color. Then hold down the Shift key and click and drag over the stripes and select any color that you feel like you might have missed. Now if you feel like you went too far and you selected other colors outside of the blue, just use this eyedropper here. It's the eyedropper with the minus sign. In this way, you can go ahead and sample away different colors so you make sure that you aren't choosing other colors. You can increase the fuzziness slider to increase the overall range of that selection. In this way, it can broaden or soften those edges. And here, though, you just want to be careful that you aren't selecting other things like the face or the background. So we want to decrease that so we make sure that those items aren't selected. Well, here we have our first color change. We've worked on the color that we have here with the stripes. Let's apply that change by clicking OK. Here we can see the before and then now the after. Well, next I want to work on the hat. And we could, of course, go back to our replace color command, but rather than doing that, I want to make a selection because this hat has a pretty good and defined edge. So let's use Quick Select to make a selection. Press the Quick Select tool or press the W key on the keyboard and then change your brush size. Here my brush is too big, so I'll press the left bracket key to make my brush smaller. Then I'll go ahead and click and paint over the hat in order to build up this selection. Here we'll see if we can't get a decent selection of the hat. If you select too much, hold down the Option key on Mac, Alt on Windows, and paint away the area that you've selected. You just want to make sure that you have all of the hat there. Whenever you use Quick Select, you know that you also need to refine the edge of the selection. So let's click on the Refine Edge button. You'll find that up here in the Options bar. Go ahead and click on Refine Edge, and what that will do is it will allow us to view this particular selection here that we have. We can toggle through the views in different ways. If you press the F key, you can see that you can select or view this in different ways. What I want to do is see the hat on white. By pressing the F key, you toggle through the different views of your selection until you get to a view which helps you to see the edges. Here, I can see the edges, and they don't look very good. No big deal. Click on Smart Radius and crank that up. That will really clean up those edges. Then we need to add more contrast there to define the edge. And of course, we'll want to smooth these out just a little bit. Maybe add just a touch of feather because we're working with color. We want to have nice soft transitions around those edges. Well, now that we have refined our edge selections, click OK. When we click OK, that will bring us back to the image and the selection that we have here. Well, now to change the color in this area, I want to use Hue Saturation. Here we'll click on the Hue Saturation icon, which will create a Hue Saturation adjustment layer with a mask based on the selection which we just created. Now, one way that you can use Hue Saturation is to click on the Colorize option. This is a great option when it comes to changing color when you want a really consistent color all across that area. In this case, it defaulted to this navy blue, which actually was pretty good. So I'll go ahead and try to find a nice blue there again. Then we can change the saturation slider. I'm going to decrease the saturation and then darken this up using the lightness slider. We can create a bit more of a navy blue that way and just dial this in until we have a nice color look for that. And here I don't need to get too exact, but I do want it to look good. That's the thing with all these sliders, right? You can keep tweaking them until you get it just right. Well, I like the look of that. Let's take a look at how we've done. Here's our overall before. And then now here's our after. And here with this image, I just wanted to illustrate a bit of a workflow, how we can start off using replace color but then we can also integrate into our workflow other techniques and skills that we have in regards to making selections or making color changes like we did here using hue saturation and also replace color. At this stage in our journey into working with creative color, I find it's helpful to take a few minutes to dig into working with the hue saturation controls, because these controls are some of the most common and most powerful controls that we have when it comes to changing and modifying color in Photoshop. We'll be working with this demo file, which has 2 layers. Go ahead and turn on the visibility of both layers, and then click on the hue saturation icon in order to create a hue saturation adjustment. Then position your cursor over the edge of this little dialog and make it bigger. In this way, we can start to focus in on the controls and really understand what's happening here. Now, I'll start off with some basics. We'll talk about how we can change color, and then we'll get a bit deeper so that we can really understand how these controls work. All right, well, first, a bit of a review. Here you can see we have 3 sliders, hue, saturation, and lightness. As I drag the hue slider, it allows me to remap the colors. You can understand this if you look at the color strips below. The top color strip here, that's the original color. The underline or the bottom color strip, that's the new color. So whatever was blue, well, that's now green. And whatever was red, well, that's now blue. And as we drag the hue slider around, we can see how it's shifting all of the colors in the photograph. Saturation, that's easy, right? Increase or decrease the saturation. Lightness, same thing, that's easy to understand, either darken or brighten the photograph. All right, well, let's reset this dialog and let's take a look at Colorize. When you turn on Colorize, what you'll notice is that it remaps all of the colors in your photograph to one color. Here, if we increase the saturation slider so we can see that red a little bit better, you can see it's taking whatever color we had in our image and it's making it now red. Or we can change that color as well by using this slider. In Colorize is really helpful, obviously, when you want to change the color in your image to one color, when you want to sort of color tint the entire photograph. All right, well, let's go ahead and reset our sliders and take a look at how we can get more specific. Now, if we have 2 colors like this layer here where we have blue and red, and we just want to change one color, well, we have 2 options. We can either click on the pull-down menu and choose the color from this pull-down menu option, or perhaps an even better way is to click on the targeted adjustment tool and then click on the image. In doing that, you can see it took me to the reds, and it also built a selection. We'll talk more about how hue saturation selects color in a minute, but you can see here that it's selecting an area on this color strip. Well, as I make a change to this, you can see that the change is only happening in this area. It isn't happening in the blues over here or in the greens over here. Again, it's limiting or isolating the change of the color. Let's say that we want to change this to a green. Great. Well, what about changing the blue? Just select this tool here and then go ahead and click on the blue. Notice it took me to the blues channel and built a selection down below, and in this case we can then change that here. So as you can see, this tool gives us really specific and precise control. Yet we need to understand how this tool works and how the selection works in order to really harness the power of what we can do here. So let's go ahead and reset this dialog and let's turn off the eye icon on this colors layer. Here we have something which is a bit more realistic. We have a gradient. We have reds, oranges, yellows, and greens. And what I want to do is I want to focus in on the yellows. So in this case, we use the targeted adjustment tool and we click on the yellows. It brought us to the yellow channel, and here we have a selection. In order to create something that we can actually see, I'm going to desaturate the yellows so that we can see that we've now removed the color, the yellows, from this area. If you focus in on the selection area here, we can understand this better this way. Notice that there are 2 white solid lines. Well, those lines signify where this color is selected in full intensity. I mean, this is completely 100%. Then we have these smaller sliders. Well, these smaller sliders, they kind of like to make friends with other colors. These are the transition sliders. So how is this going to transition from full intensity off to less and less and less intensity? If we click and drag this to the right, what we're saying is, hey, let's have this color change kind of make friends with some of those surrounding colors. Here you can see it's reaching into these reds over here. And in this case, because we're desaturating, it's removing some of those. Now let's say that rather than just reaching kind of in a friendly way, we want something kind of big and bold to happen. Well, in order to make that change, we use this little icon here. as we click and drag this to the right, notice how it's almost like it's marching forward and it's taking over all of those colors until they are all removed. The distance between these two sliders determines a transition, and you can see how we can have a hard transition or a really soft transition. Well, now that we know a little bit more about how hue saturation works, what we can do is we can start to apply this knowledge to working on color in our images. So let's go ahead and continue to work with hue saturation, and let's do that in the next movie. In this movie, we'll look at two examples and we'll build upon what we talked about in the previous movie, and that is how we can use the hue saturation adjustment controls in order to select specific colors and then to modify those colors either by changing or removing the color in those areas. All right, well, let's start off with this photograph that I captured here of some old balloons. And what I want to do is remove all of the color except for the color that we have in the two blue balloons. To do that, we'll go ahead and click on our hue saturation adjustment layer icon. And we're going to do this so that we can further understand how we can select and modify color. Let's click on the targeted adjustment tool. Let's start off with this red kind of orangish balloon down here. And clicking on that, it takes us to the red channel. It builds a selection. The two lines in the middle, that shows us the colors which are absolutely going to be affected by my adjustment. These outer icons are showing me the transition. Well, here, if I remove the color from that area, we can see that, it did a good job removing the color here, but it also removed a little bit of the orange balloon. Now, if I want to add to this selection, I can do so either by using these sliders or by using our icons. If you click on the icon of the eyedropper with the plus sign, I can click on this and you can see how it's scooting that over to the right. Notice that as I click, in order to add more of this color, it made this selection bigger. Now we can also just do this manually. Notice there's a yellow balloon in the background. Well, here I'm really close to the yellows. I'll just click and drag this to the right in order to remove the yellow from the photograph. We can do the same thing in the other direction as well. Here we can either do this softly by using this slider here to subtly remove the color, or to make more bold changes, click and drag the solid line. In doing this, you can see that we can start to remove a lot of the color from this photograph. Next, we have the blue and the green. If we want the green out, we'll just click and drag the slider off to the right. And we can also use these transition sliders as well if we want a little bit of a softer color transition. Well, now that we've removed a lot of these colors that we have here, let me just go ahead and drag this further over to the right so that we just have the blue remaining. We can then make changes. Well, currently we've desaturated, and sometimes when you use this technique, what you might do is use the desaturation slider just so you can really see which colors you've selected, and then you might bring up that saturation. So I'll bring that back. And let's say that rather than desaturating these, I just want to boost their color. Well, I can do so now. Or maybe we just want to change their color. Well, we can change just those colors here because we've built that selection using the targeted adjustment tool. And in this way, we can get really precise with our color adjustments. All right, well, now that we've seen this example, let's go ahead and take a look at another, and we'll do that in the next movie. In this movie, we'll take a look at a few examples of how we can use selective color in order to modify and change the colors in our photographs. We'll start off with this photograph here, which is a picture of a hand-painted sign. I love hand-painted signs because that's what my grandfather did for a living. And with this image, I want to bring out the reds and also change the yellows a little bit. In order to do that, we'll use selective color. Yet before we start off with selective color, I find it's helpful to brush up on color theory a little bit so that we can understand best how to work with the selective color controls. To brush up on our color theory, let's turn on this color layer and then click on the icon for selective color. You'll find it in the bottom row in the adjustments panel. All right, well, here in the selective color controls, you can see we can target specific colors. Click on the pull-down menu. We can work on the yellows, the greens, the cyans. And as we select a color to work on, we then have controls. Each of these controls allow us to modify certain colors. Notice that the first slider is called cyan, the next one magenta, then yellow and black. Well, if you know a thing or two about color theory, you may know that colors have complementary colors. Let's focus our attention on this little color wheel. Well, the complementary color to cyan, well, that's red. Therefore, this cyan slider, what it actually allows us to do is to increase the cyan if we drag it to the right, or to decrease the cyan if we drag it to the left, which in turn is adding red. So this slider allows us to work with cyan here or red over here. What about magenta? Here we can add more magenta or we can add more green. The yellow slider, well, that slider allows us to work with our yellows and our blues. Now, even if you don't know very much about color theory, all that you need to know is that each slider allows us to modify colors in a different way. And what we can do is we can sort of mix these sliders together in order to come up with some interesting and unique color looks in our photographs. All right, well, let's turn off this layer here so we can work on our image. As I mentioned, what I want to do is change the characteristics of the reds. So here, I'll go to the reds by clicking on the red channel. Next, I'll modify the color. Now, if we drag to the right, that's going to add more cyan. In turn, it's going to, in a sense, remove the red. It gives a bit more of a gritty look. Well, that isn't what I want. I want bright, vibrant reds. So I'll drag this to the left, and here we can see it's sort of lit up those reds so they're more saturated, a little bit more vibrant. Next, we have magenta. If we drag this to the left, what that's going to do is make the image a bit more orange. Drag it to the right, and it's going to bring out more of the red. Now, each color will respond differently to the way that we work with these sliders, so what you may need to do is just drag them and then see how it looks. In this case, with the yellow slider, I don't want to drag it to the left. I do want to drag it to the right. Now we're talking. Now we have this beautiful bright red. All right, what about the black slider? Drag to the left and you can lighten the reds. Drag to the right and you can darken those. Underneath, we have two options for relative and absolute. In most situations, relative will work better because it will take the color where it is, and relative to that spot, it'll make a change. Absolute makes more bold or dynamic changes. So with most photographs, I find that relative typically works better, whereas absolute may be a bit over the top. Well, what about working on the yellows? Here we can click on this pull-down menu and then choose yellows. In this case, let's jump straight to the yellow slider. Here we can either remove some of the yellow or we can bring that up. Now, you won't always just use one slider. Typically, you'll work on other sliders, and here you can see how we can swing the yellow, I should say. Here, I'll drag this to the left because I want a little bit of a brighter yellow there. Here's before and after. The cyan slider isn't going to do very much for our yellows, yet it does sort of tint it just a touch, so you may modify that a little bit. But you'll discover that certain sliders won't affect certain colors, and you'll just need to drag those, again, one way and then the other. What about brightening these up? Well, we can do that, or we can darken those down a little bit with this slider here. All right, well, let's look at our results. Here they are, the before and then now the after. So as you can see, selective color allows you to really target those colors and make changes in unique ways. All right, well, now that we've seen this example and also talked a little bit about how selective color works, let's go ahead and take a look at a few more examples, and let's do that in the next movie. Now that we know a little bit about selective color, I want to put selective color through its paces and work on a few different examples. We'll start with one which the results will be a bit more subtle, and then we'll have a few others where we'll make some more dramatic adjustments to color. With this photograph, what I first want to do is work on the reds that we have here in the truck. To do that, click on the adjustment layer icon for selective color, and then from the pull-down menu, choose reds. Now with the reds, we know that we can use the cyan slider in order to remove red by dragging this to the right, or you can increase that by dragging it to the left. Next, another great way to work with reds is to increase magenta and yellow. Here I'll go ahead and bring up my magenta and my yellow a little bit as well, so I can just sort of mix these together to have a bit brighter red there. Here it is before and then now after. Just brings a little bit better focus into that area of the image. We can also darken that red if we want to, or brighten it up as well. This way, we can customize the way that area of the image looks. Well, next, one of the things that I'm noticing as I click on my eye icon, the truck looks better, but it's also affected the sand down here. If you look closely, you'll see a bit of a color shift. What we might need to do is to mask this color adjustment into a certain area. We'll take a look at how we can do that in a moment. Yet next, I want to work on the sky. The sky is a little bit dull. A lot of times this happens when we have sky and it just appears a little bit too light blue. Well, to change that, we can go into our cyans and our blues. Here, I'll go ahead and choose the cyans to start off, and the yellow slider, it allows us to increase the yellow or remove yellow, in a sense, add more blue. We also want to add a little bit of cyan there, and then modify the magenta. This controls that overall color, so we can have a sky which is a bit more purple or a bit more cyan. And again, just modify that until it looks good. Then I'll darken this up a little bit and go back to my sliders to make sure that that color looks nice. Then, Here we'll click on the blues and do something similar. We'll increase the cyans a little bit there, the density of that area, make those a little bit more blue. And if they're getting too purple, you compensate with the magenta slider. So bring this to the right, it becomes purple. Bring this to the left, and it becomes a little bit more cyan. So you just want to find the exact type of color that you want there. And then click on the eye icon. You can see here's before, and now here's after. It's a pretty subtle adjustment, but nonetheless, it's improved this photograph and added some more vivid colors to the image. So again, here's the before, then here's after. Now, if ever you need to mask away the color effect from a certain area, just click into the mask, grab your brush tool, and here we'll paint with black. I want to choose a brush which is relatively big, no hardness at all there, 100% opacity, and I'll just start to paint this effect away from this area. In this way, I'm just going to limit that color look to the image to the upper area and also to the truck. So here you can see we have a mask which we've added. So now we've worked with selective color and masking together in order to add a little snap or punch to this photograph. All right, well, let's take a look at another example. Here, I'll open up another photograph. This is a picture that we have of an old neon sign. And let's say that we want to brighten up the yellow of this neon tube here and also change this turquoise color to something which is a bit closer to blue. Well, to do that, we'll click on the selective color adjustment layer icon. And let's start off with the yellows. Now, what's tricky when working with selective color is that your gut will say, well, just go with the yellow slider. And you'll drag the yellow slider up and down, and here it really doesn't even do that much at all. Yet, if you work with the other sliders as well and say add more magenta, all of a sudden I can make this green or red. And so we can really change this. And again, it's using the sliders together. Sometimes you'll modify a slider like this and say, well, it's green. That's not what I want. I want yellow. Well, don't give up. Experiment. Imagine you're a kid mixing paint together. Well, what else could you mix in here? We'll add a little bit more red, and now we have this neon yellow, which is just sort of snapping or popping. It's coming to life in a new way. Now, if ever you start to make adjustments and you feel like you're sort of losing the texture in the image, you can always bring that back by taking your blending mode to color. Actually, let me demo this by going to another channel. Here I'm going to go to the blues. And in the blues, I'm going to make some bad adjustments. I'm going to darken, I'm going to bring up my yellows, my magenta, my cyan. I'll do the same thing in my cyans. Again, just over the top for a moment. Well, here you can see that it's really changing the overall kind of brightness and texture that we have in the photograph. If that happens, take this blending mode to color. You can do that by clicking on the layer blending mode pull-down menu and then choose color. Now you can see we have a color change, yet it's not as dramatic in regards to losing detail in the photograph. So if ever you're finding that you're losing detail, you may need to go to that color blending mode to try to bring some of it back. That's especially helpful, say if you're working with reds and if the reds are oversaturated and you just have loss of texture or detail. All right, well here, let's go back and make a few more adjustments to the cyans and the blues. I'll bring these sliders back down. I just wanted to crank all of those up to sort of illustrate how we could work with that color blending mode. All right, well here, the cyans are going to be the channel which is the money channel, right? Because this will allow us to really control the color that we have. And if we want to make these more blue, we'll remove some yellow or add some blue there. We'll bring up our magenta slider. The cyan will allow us to control a little bit of the characteristic of what type of blue we have. And here we have this image which almost has this, almost like a watercolor look or a hand-tinted, hand-painted type of look. After seeing the blue, I realized my yellow is too strong. We'll just go back to the yellows. And then here you can modify these sliders, right? We can customize how far we go with each of these sliders and change the brightness or darkness of that in order to bring that to an area which looks a little bit better. All right, again, just another example of using the sliders in order to create vivid or interesting color. Let's look at one more example. In this next example, I want to show you, let's say that the client, or let's say that you've decided that you just want to change the color. You want the ocean and sky to be purple, and you want the boat to be yellow. Well, in order to make those changes with selective color, we'll click on the selective color adjustment layer icon, and then we'll go to probably the most dominant color in the image, the cyans and the blues. So start with your bigger color first. And what we know is that we can change the color characteristics. And we can change those by using a slider, in this case removing cyan, and then using another slider and pushing that together. And here, because we push these two to their extremes, we now have this purple tint in the photograph. Of course, you never want to give up with just using one or two sliders. Always use them all together in order to come up with the exact color that you want in your photograph. Okay, well now we have this change of color for the sea and the sky. What about the boat? Go to the reds. Here in the red channel, what we want to do is sort of flip the way that these reds are working. So in the magenta channel, we can make some pretty strong adjustments. So here we'll work with magentas. We also can use the cyan channel to control color as well. And then the yellow channel, right? That's going to help us bring in some yellow. Really, it's a combination of all the sliders together, which allow us to create this really dramatic kind of hand-painted type of look in our photograph. And one of the reasons why I wanted to walk through so many examples was to get you thinking about how you can use these sliders. I also wanted to help you realize that you don't need to be intimidated by selective color. Often people open up selective color and they think, oh my gosh, all these sliders, color theory, I don't know how this works. Well, don't worry. All that you need to do is swing the sliders together to mix them and let go of your technical kind of fear of color theory and think of it as mixing paint as a little kid. And sometimes when you mix certain colors together, you all of a sudden come up with something interesting. And the more that you use selective color, the more useful it will become. And here I've shown you a few examples where you can modify or change colors. And in these examples, we've just been having some fun. Yet keep in mind, you can also use selective color to make corrections. I've had a few images where I've used selective color and it has just saved the day because it allowed me to get into that color area and make really subtle tweaks so that the final image looked that much better. All right, well, either way, I hope you enjoyed this tour of how you can start to use selective color in order to change and modify the colors in your photographs. One of the most intuitive and sometimes one of the most fun color adjustment tools that you can use is color balance. So let's take a look at how we can use color balance on a few images in order to change or modify the colors in our photographs. Here we have a family portrait down at a beach, and what I want to do is warm this image up. To do that, we'll use color balance. You can click on the color balance icon right here. You can find it in the adjustments panel. And on this first image, we'll keep things pretty simple. All that I want to do is drag my slider to the right in order to increase the reds. I also want to increase the yellows. The reason why I said this is intuitive is because it's color-coded. So here we can see as we drag this towards that color, the image takes on more of that color characteristic. If we want a little bit more magenta, we can add a touch more of that as well. So far, here we have our before and then now our after. Much nicer color in the photograph. Yet we can also dig deeper into these controls. Here we can work on the shadows. If we click shadows, this allows us to make color adjustments in the darker areas of the photograph. Again, we can cool those off or warm those up. And as you make these adjustments, often what you can do is you can go through and you can stack up the adjustments so that you can focus on the shadows differently than the midtones or the highlights. Here in the shadows, I might just bring up my reds a little bit and bring down the magentas and yellows a touch as well. Let's compare that, say, to the midtones. Well, the midtones, we have completely different amounts. And the same thing could be said for going to the highlights. And by working on these different areas, we can start to really fine-tune exactly how we want these colors to appear. And we can use these sliders to enhance color like we're doing here, or to create really vivid and surreal colors. You can make really strong adjustments by dragging these sliders really far to either side of the spectrum, or you can just make little teeny adjustments as well. With this photograph, I think it's better to make a bit more subtle so that here's our before, and then click on the eye icon again, and we can see here's the after. It just looks more warm and inviting. All right, well, let's take a look at making more vivid colors using color balance. To do that, I'll open up a photograph of a sunrise. The color in this image is a little bit lackluster. So let's boost the color by opening up color balance. Here, we'll start off in the shadows, the darker tones. There are a lot of those in this photograph. We can change the characteristic of the image by making the darker tones much more blue and cyan. If you don't like the mix of the blue and the cyan together, we'll just add a little bit of magenta. In this case, you can see I can make it more of a true blue color. So we could have these deep dark blues, then we could go to the highlights. And in the highlights, we could warm everything up, add more yellows and reds and maybe even some magenta. And here, all of a sudden, we have a completely different look. Here's before, and then now here's after. Well, with this look, while it's different, I don't necessarily like it, so I'll reset it. Click on the reset icon. What else could we do with this image? Well, here, one of the things that we could do is we could increase our overall color, say by bringing up our reds and our magentas and our yellows. And let's say that actually what we want is a sunset which has these bright, vivid colors and it has a bit more brightness to it. So here in my midtones, I brought up my reds, brought down the magentas, and ended up bringing up the blues a little bit as well. Next, I'll go into the shadows. In the shadows, again, I want more red in that area. And then I'll also just bring out the magenta and the yellow characteristics. Here I'm looking to try to create really vivid, dynamic look to this photograph. Last but not least, we'll travel to the highlights. And here in the highlights, we can control the colors that we have in the brighter tones of the image. And sometimes it's fun just to slide these colors around and see what the photograph might look like. All right, well, there you have it. Another way that we could modify the color in this image, which was completely different than before. Here's our before, and then now here's our after. When it comes to creative color in Photoshop, there isn't necessarily one adjustment or one technique which is best. And sometimes it's a combination of techniques which can allow you to come up with the most interesting results. So here in this movie, let's take a look at how we can stack up adjustments in order to come up with a dramatic color effect for this photograph. This is a photograph that I captured in Austin, Texas. The sun was setting, and all of these bats were leaving their little homes to fly off into the sky to catch bugs, and it was a surreal experience. And so what I want to do is create really bright, vivid colors here, and I want the colors to be red and yellow and golden. So let's take a look at how we can create an effect like that. We'll start off by clicking on our adjustment layer icon for vibrance and saturation. If you drag the vibrance slider to the right, what it will allow you to do is to increase color variety and also a bit of saturation. Let's go ahead and apply that adjustment and then click on the eye icon. Here's before and then here's after. It just deepened my blues and also brighten up some of the yellows and the oranges. Next, I want to change the color entirely. So here we'll use color bounce. With color bounce, I'm going to start off in the shadows. And in the shadows, I'll bring up my reds a little bit. Also bring in some magenta and maybe a little bit of yellow there. Next, we'll go to the midtones. In the midtones, we're going to bring up our reds. This will change the color characteristics quite a bit. We'll also bring in some nice yellows there, maybe even a touch of magenta. All right, well here, I'm getting closer to the color palette that I want. These really rich kind of reds and yellows. Next, let's go to our highlights. When we go to the highlights, we can really brighten up the image by bringing up some more reds and yellows. In doing that, it's almost like the sunset is just sort of turning on. So again, just exaggerate this here a little bit so we have this really vivid color. Here's before, and then now here's after. Well, so far, I like the direction of this, but I want to bring in some more contrast and some more color saturation. Well, to do that, we'll use curves. Go ahead and click on the curves adjustment layer icon and start off in the composite RGB curve and just create a default S curve. Brighten up the whites there a little bit and then click and drag down to darken the shadows. And so again, this little S curve with this color project kind of makes all the difference in the world, right? Here's the before and then the after. Yet that being said, without the vibrance layer, well, we wouldn't have all of that variety or that little bit of difference that we have there. And of course, color balance did quite a bit for us as well. The great thing about working with curves and color is you can also get into the different channels. Like you can go into the red channel and boost the reds even further. Here, if we want to bring out a little more red, well, we could do that. Go to the green magenta channel, drag this down to add a little bit of magenta. Go to the blue yellow channel, and then click and drag down as well to add a little bit more yellow. And again, we're just finessing the overall color look in this picture. Yet the point here is to really illustrate this idea that sometimes it's about stacking up these different adjustments. Often it's easy to get excited, say about color bounce. So we use color bounce and we come up with color like this and we think it's great. Yet we're only barely scratching the surface. Because by combining color bounce with our vibrance adjustment, well, it allowed us just to have a little bit more variety in the photograph. And then by finishing off by making an advanced adjustment using curves, using that S curve and then getting into those channels and dragging up and down on the curve, well, it allowed us to accomplish something completely different. Now, of course, these type of techniques are much more advanced because we're using multiple adjustments and multiple layers. Yet, as you dig into working with color in creative ways in Photoshop, I recommend that you start blending together all of your skills. Use your skills and knowledge of curves. Combine that with what you now know of color bounce and some of the other color adjustment tools. And often, by combining all of these techniques together or multiple techniques together, it can help you come up with interesting results as we were able to do so with this photograph here.